The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Redemption Creek as Charlotte Hawkins adjusted the binding that flattened her chest beneath her brother's old shirt. Her weathered face, bronzed by 6 months on the trail and disguised beneath a carefully trimmed false mustache, revealed nothing of the grief that had driven her to abandon her life as a Boston schoolteacher. With each passing day, the woman she had been faded further beneath the convincing mask of Charlie Hawkins, a drifter seeking work in a territory where men made their own justice and no one looked too closely at a stranger's past. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Charlotte tightened the worn leather gun belt around her narrow waist, the Colt revolver hanging heavy against her hip, a constant reminder of the promise she had made over her brother's grave. Sheriff Thomas Hawkins had been the only law in Blackwater Canyon until 3 bullets silenced his determination to bring order to a lawless frontier. Now, his killer walked free, protected by powerful men who controlled the territory from polished offices, while blood stained the parched earth of disputed lands. The small boarding house room she had rented under her male disguise offered privacy enough to maintain her deception. A cracked mirror reflected the transformation she had perfected, hair cut short beneath a wide-brimmed hat, shoulders squared with practiced determination, voice lowered to a gravelly drawl that discouraged conversation. The daguerreotype she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard, showed a different Charlotte, smiling beside her brother, her hair long and styled in the Eastern fashion, her dress proper and feminine. That woman no longer existed except in fading memories. Charlotte tucked a folded map into her vest pocket and checked that her knife was secure in her boot. Today, she would begin work at the Silver Dollar Ranch, owned by James Hollister, the man who had signed her brother's death warrant with a nod to his hired guns. 6 months of tracking, of learning to move and speak and think like the men she hunted, had led her to this opportunity to infiltrate Hollister's operation and find the evidence that would bring justice to Thomas's memory. She stepped out into the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, a frontier settlement that had sprung up to service the cattle operations and mining claims that dotted the territory. The town existed in the shadow of larger settlements, unremarkable except for its strategic location near the borders where different jurisdictions blurred and lawmen were reluctant to venture. Perfect for men with something to hide. Perfect for Charlotte's purposes. "Mornin', Charlie," called Silas Parker from the general store porch, the aging shopkeeper having accepted Charlotte's disguise without question like everyone else in town. "Heard you're heading out to the Silver Dollar today. Watch yourself with that bunch." Charlotte nodded, keeping her response brief in the lower register she had trained herself to use. "Appreciate the warning." "Hollister don't keep men long," Silas continued, whittling at a piece of pine. "Those that ask questions tend to disappear, same as what happened to that sheriff over in Blackwater last spring." Charlotte's hand tightened imperceptibly on her saddle as she secured it to her horse, a sturdy roan gelding chosen for endurance rather than speed. "That's so?" she asked, forcing casualness into her tone. Silas examined his handiwork. "Shame. Too. Heard that sheriff was cleaning up Blackwater proper, had a sister back east somewhere. School teacher, they say." For a moment, Charlotte wondered if the old man knew more than he revealed, but his expression remained placid, his attention on his whittling, just passing along gossip then, the lifeblood of small frontier communities. Still, it reminded her to be cautious. If word of her connection to Thomas had reached this far, others might make the same connection. Man ought to be careful these days, she replied, mounting her horse with the practiced ease that had become second nature. Never know who's watching. The ride to the Silver Dollar took the better part of 2 hours, the trail winding through scrubland that gradually gave way to greener pastures. Charlotte had studied maps of the territory meticulously, memorizing boundaries, water sources, and the locations of neighboring ranches. Knowledge was protection in a land where a wrong turn could mean trespassing on claimed territory, a mistake that men had died for. The ranch house came into view as she crested a low rise, a sprawling single-story structure of timber and stone that spoke of ambition rather than the humble beginnings most ranchers claimed. Bunkhouses, corrals, and outbuildings spread outward from the main house, while cattle dotted the surrounding hillsides. Men on horseback patrolled the perimeter, more men than a simple ranching operation would require. As Charlotte approached the main gate, a rider intercepted her, a Winchester rifle resting casually across his saddle. His face was scarred from what appeared to be an old burn, the tissue pulling his mouth into a permanent sneer. "Help you?" he asked, though the question contained no offer of assistance. "Charlie Hawkins," she answered, using the name she had adopted. "Foreman Jenkins hired me on yesterday in town. Said to report this morning." The man studied her with narrowed eyes, taking in her worn clothing, her gear, and the way she sat her horse. Charlotte had learned that most men saw what they expected. To see another drifter looking for work, unremarkable among the countless others who moved through the territories seeking opportunity or escape. "New blood," he finally said. "Jenkins mentioned it. Follow the main path to the bunkhouse. He'll find you." Charlotte nodded her thanks, keeping her expression neutral as she urged her horse forward. The first barrier passed. Now came the harder work of integrating herself into a world built on masculine codes and violence, all while searching for the evidence that would bring her brother's killers to justice. The bunkhouse was typical of its kind. A long, low building with bunks for 20 men, though it appeared less than half were currently occupied. A pot of coffee simmered on the iron stove at one end, the aroma mixing with tobacco, leather, and unwashed bodies. Several men looked up as she entered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to indifference. "You, Hawkins?" A tall man with a shock of grey hair and a full beard rose from a table where he'd been repairing a bridle. "Jenkins. We spoke in town." "That's right," Charlotte confirmed, extending her hand in the firm grip she had practiced countless times. Jenkins' handshake was brief but testing, measuring her strength. "Bunks over there. Stow your gear. We're branding today. Want to see what you're made of before assigning you regular duties." Charlotte had prepared for this moment. During her months tracking her brother's killers, she had taken work at smaller ranches, learning the skills necessary to maintain her disguise. She had built calluses and muscle, trained herself to move and work like the men around her. It had been painful, exhausting work, but necessary for moments like this. "Just tell me where you need me," she replied, moving to the empty bunk and setting down her meager possessions. The branding operation was in full swing when Charlotte arrived at the corral with Jenkins. Teams of cowboys worked with practiced efficiency, some roping calves and dragging them to the branding fires, others applying the hot irons, still others releasing the bawling animals back to their mothers. It was grueling work under the hot sun, the air thick with dust and the smell of singed hair. Jenkins pointed to a group working the ropes. "Show me what you can do with a lariat, Hawkins." Charlotte took a coiled rope from a fence post and moved into position. This was a skill she had worked particularly hard to master, knowing it would be expected on any ranch. Her first throw caught a calf cleanly around the hind legs, drawing raised eyebrows from the men around her. "Not bad," Jenkins allowed, watching. As she secured the calf for branding, "Where'd you learn to rope like that?" "Worked my way through 6 ranches from Texas to here," she answered with the backstory she had created. "Man learns quick or goes hungry." Among the workers, one man stood out, taller than the others, with jet black hair pulled back at the nape of his neck and features that marked him as Native American, likely Sioux from his clothing and the pattern of beadwork on his leather vest. Unlike the others, he worked alone, efficiently cutting calves from the herd and driving them toward the branding area. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. His movements were fluid and economical, and though the other men gave him space, there was a palpable respect in their deference. "Who's in that?" Charlotte asked Jenkins, keeping her tone casually curious as she prepared for another throw. "Swift Hawk," Jenkins replied. "Best tracker and hunter in the territory. Hollister pays him double what the rest of us get, and he's worth every cent. Half the men are afraid of him, other half wish they were him. Stays to himself mostly." Throughout the day, Charlotte felt Swift Hawk's dark eyes on her occasionally, assessing in a way different from the other men. Where they saw another cowhand, he seemed to be looking through her disguise, his gaze thoughtful rather than suspicious. She kept her distance, focusing on the work and establishing herself as competent and unremarkable. As the sun began to set, transforming the landscape into a tableau of oranges and purples, the men gathered around outdoor tables where the ranch cook had prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee. Charlotte took her plate and found a seat at the edge of the group, eating with the measured pace she had adopted, not too dainty to arouse suspicion, but careful not to mimic the slovenly habits of some of the men. Conversations flowed around her, fragments of ranch gossip and territory politics that she archived mentally for later examination. Any information might prove useful in her quest. "Hear about the trouble over in Blackwater?" one cowboy asked between mouthfuls. "Army's sending troops after some Sioux crossed the reservation boundary. Blackwater's been nothing but trouble since they lost their sheriff," another replied. "Ain't had proper law since Hawkins got himself killed." Charlotte kept her expression neutral, though her heart hammered at the casual mention of her brother. The name coincidence between her alias and Thomas's real surname had been deliberate, a small connection to her purpose that provided some comfort during lonely nights. "Hollister's got interests in Blackwater, don't he?" a third man joined in. "Heard him and Caldwell talking about mines or some such over that way." "Best keep your ears to yourself," Jenkins interrupted, his tone sharp with warning. "Mr. Hollister's business ain't for discussion." The conversation shifted abruptly to safer topics, but Charlotte had caught a valuable thread. Caldwell, that would be Harold Caldwell, the mining magnate whose name had appeared in Thomas's journal, one of the men her brother had been investigating before his death. A connection between Hollister and Caldwell strengthened her suspicions about a wider conspiracy. As the men finished eating and drifted toward a barrel of whiskey being opened nearby, Charlotte rose to take her plate back to the wash station. As she turned, she found Swift Hawk directly in her path, his tall figure silhouetted against the fading light. "You ride well," he said, his English perfect but accented. "For someone not raised to it." Charlotte maintained her composure, though. Alarm bells rang internally. "Been riding since I was old enough to reach stirrups," she replied in her practiced drawl. Swift Hawk's expression remained impassive, his eyes studying her face with unsettling intensity. "A man brings his past with him, no matter how far he travels. Yours follows close behind." Before she could respond, he moved past her toward the corral where several horses needed attention. The encounter lasted only moments, but left Charlotte deeply unsettled. Had he seen through her disguise, or was he simply commenting on the careful way she held herself apart from the others? Later that night, after the other men had fallen into whiskey-induced sleep or card games, Charlotte slipped away to check on her horse and gather her thoughts. The roan nickered softly as she approached, and she took comfort in the simple animal. Affection as she stroked his nose. "Your secret weighs on you," a voice came from the shadows, causing Charlotte to whirl, her hand dropping instinctively to her holstered pistol. Swift Hawk stepped into the lantern light, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. I would speak with Charlie Hawkins, who is not Charlie Hawkins. Charlotte drew her Colt, holding it steady despite the fear coursing through her. Don't know what you're talking about, she said, deepening her voice further. You bind your chest. He stated matter-of-factly. You sit a horse like one who learned as a woman rides, then corrected it. You watch the men to copy them, but your eyes are different. You seek something here beyond work. The world seemed to narrow to this moment, her deception unraveled by this perceptive stranger. 6 months of careful preparation threatened to collapse, along with any hope of justice for Thomas. If you expose me, I'll shoot you, she threatened, though her voice lacked conviction. Swift Hawk made no move toward her, keeping his hands visible. If I wished to expose you, I would have spoken to Jenkins, not to you alone. I'm curious about what brings a woman to hide herself among men who would harm her if they knew. Charlotte hesitated, the pistol becoming heavy in her hand. This man could destroy everything she had worked for, yet he had sought her out privately, rather than revealing her. After long moments of internal debate, she lowered the gun slightly. Why should I trust you? She asked, her natural voice emerging for the first time in months. You should not, he answered honestly. Trust is earned, but we each have reasons to be where we do not belong. Perhaps our purposes may align. As the moon rose over the Silver Dollar Ranch, Charlotte Hawkins faced the first real test of her mission. In the shadows of the stable, confronted by a man who had seen through her carefully constructed disguise, she had to decide whether to flee, fight, or take an enormous risk on the word of a stranger whose own motivations remained as mysterious as her presence on the ranch. The path to justice for her brother had just become infinitely more complicated, and dawn would bring new challenges she could not yet imagine. Charlotte kept her pistol trained on Swift Hawk, the moonlight casting sharp shadows across the stable yard. Her mind raced through possibilities. Flee now and abandon months of preparation, silence him permanently, or take an unfathomable risk on a stranger who had pierced her carefully constructed facade. How long have you known? She asked, her voice returning to its natural register after months of forced lowering. Since you first rode in, Swift Hawk replied, his tone matter-of-fact rather than triumphant. My people learn to see what is hidden, not merely what is shown. You move between worlds, as do I. Charlotte studied him, searching for deception or threat. She found neither, only a calm assessment that matched her own. You said our purposes might align, explain. Swift Hawk glanced toward the bunkhouse, where the sounds of drunken card games continued. Satisfied they had privacy, he spoke in a lower voice. James Hollister and his allies push boundaries that are not theirs to cross. They take land from my people through papers we cannot read and agreements we never made. 6 moons ago, they killed our emissary, who traveled to Blackwater, seeking the sheriff's help. The mention of Blackwater and its sheriff sent a jolt through Charlotte. Thomas Hawkins, she whispered, the name tasting foreign after months of disuse. The sheriff was my brother. Understanding dawned in Swift Hawk's eyes. You seek his killers, as I seek justice for Red Feather, who died trying to reach your brother with evidence of broken treaties. Charlotte holstered her weapon slowly, the pieces aligning into a clearer picture. My brother's journal mentioned meeting with a Sioux representative. He was killed 3 days later, shot in the back while riding alone. A moment of silence passed between them, recognition of shared loss, bridging cultural divides. Why are you here? She finally asked. Working for the man responsible for such suffering? To watch, Swift Hawk answered simply. To learn where they plan to move next. What lands they covet, what papers they forge. I send word to my chief, who takes our case to the Indian agency, though few there listen. Charlotte's tactical mind saw the opportunity before her. An ally within the ranch, one with different access than she would have as a newly hired hand, could prove invaluable. Yet trust came neither easily nor quickly to her. Not after witnessing how corruption had spread through the territory like a disease. "If I am to believe you," she said carefully, "you'll need to offer more than words." Swifthawk nodded, accepting her caution. "Tomorrow night, Hollister meets with men from the east. Men in suits who bring money and take maps. They gather in his study. As his tracker, I patrol the grounds during such meetings. I can create an opportunity for you to listen." The offer was precisely what Charlotte needed, access to information that might connect Hollister directly to her brother's murder. Yet it seemed too convenient, like bait in a trap. "And if this is a test?" she challenged. "If Hollister suspects me and you're his instrument to confirm it?" Something like respect flickered across Swifthawk's features. "You think as a survivor must. Come with me." He moved toward the shadowed side of the stables, giving her space to follow or retreat as she chose. After a moment's hesitation, Charlotte followed, her hand never straying far from her holstered Colt. Behind the stables, concealed by a stack of hay bales, Swifthawk revealed a small opening in the wooden wall. From this hidden cache, he withdrew a leather pouch and handed it to Charlotte. Inside, she found papers, what appeared to be survey maps marked with annotations in flowing script, alongside correspondence bearing the territorial governor's seal. Even in the dim light, she recognized the significance of what she held. These were documents that could implicate powerful men in land fraud and treaty violations. "I cannot read the white man's words," Swifthawk explained, "but I recognized your brother's name here." He pointed to a letter that mentioned Sheriff Hawkins by name, noting his unfortunate interference in development matters. Charlotte's breath caught. This was the first tangible evidence connecting her brother's murder to the larger conspiracy she had suspected. "Why show me this? Why not take it to federal authorities? Who would believe a Sioux?" Swifthawk's question needed no answer. "And these alone are not enough. They suggest but do not prove. We need more, the voices of the men themselves admitting their deeds." The logic was sound, if risky. "Tomorrow night," Charlotte agreed, returning the documents to their hiding place. "But know this, if you betray me, my last act will be to put a bullet in James Hollister." "I've nothing left to lose." Swifthawk's expression remained unreadable. "When a wolf is cornered, it is most dangerous. Hollister would do well to remember this about both of us." The next day passed with excruciating slowness. Charlotte threw herself into ranch work, determined to reinforce her cover as Charlie Hawkins, the unremarkable drifter. She repaired fence lines, moved cattle between pastures, and ate with the other hands, all while acutely aware of Swifthawk's occasional presence on the periphery, their secret understanding invisible to others. By mid-afternoon, activity at the main house increased. A cook from town arrived with additional supplies, and Jenkins selected 3 hands to stand guard at the property entrance, clear indicators that Hollister was expecting important visitors. "Hawkins," Jenkins called as Charlotte finished watering her horse. "Need someone to help stock the main house woodpile for tonight. Hollister's having guests." The assignment was perfect, a legitimate reason to be near the house during the evening's meeting. "I can handle that," she replied in her practiced drawl. "When you're done, steer clear of the main house," Jenkins added, his tone carrying clear warning. "Mr. Hollister values his privacy when conducting business." Charlotte nodded her understanding, inwardly calculating how this task would position her perfectly for whatever opportunity Swifthawk might create later. As she loaded split logs into a wheelbarrow, she caught sight of a dust cloud approaching from the east, riders coming at a steady pace along the main road. The visitors arrived as Charlotte was stacking wood against the side of the main house. 3 well-dressed men, whose tailored suits and polished boots marked them as distinctly different from the rough ranch hands. From her position, she could observe without being obvious. noting details that might prove important. The oldest appeared to be in his 60s, heavy-set, with the florid complexion of a man accustomed to rich food and drink. The second was younger, perhaps 40, with the sharp eyes and calculating demeanor of a lawyer or banker. The third struck Charlotte immediately, tall and distinguished with silver temples and a cavalry officer's bearing. She recognized him from wanted posters in her brother's office. Colonel William Forsyth, retired from military service and now representing various investment interests in the territory. Hollister himself emerged to greet them, a man Charlotte had observed only from a distance until now, tall and broad-shouldered, with a carefully trimmed beard and expensive clothes that set him apart from his employees. Hollister embodied frontier success built on ruthless determination. Nothing in his manner suggested the murderer she knew him to be, which made him all the more dangerous. "Gentlemen, welcome to Silver Dollar," Hollister's voice carried clearly. "I trust your journey was uneventful?" "As can be expected," the middle-aged man replied, "though we passed a cavalry detachment heading toward Blackwater. Indian troubles brewing again, I hear." "Nothing that need concern us," Hollister assured them. "My arrangement with several chiefs has secured our interests in the region. Please, come inside. Dinner awaits, and we have much to discuss." Charlotte continued stacking wood, keeping her movement steady and her head down as the men entered the house. Their casual mention of arrangements with chiefs raised questions about Swifthawk's claims. Was there division among the Sioux about these land deals? Or were these men referring to coerced or falsified agreements? As dusk settled over the ranch, Charlotte completed her assigned task and retreated to the bunkhouse as expected. The other hands were engaged in their evening rituals, some playing cards, others cleaning equipment or simply smoking and exchanging exaggerated tales of past exploits. She had learned to participate just enough to avoid standing out, losing small amounts at poker and contributing occasional comments to conversations. "Those city men come to buy more land?" one of the younger hands asked Jenkins, who had returned in from delivering messages to the main house. "Mr. Hollister's business ain't yours," Jenkins replied sharply. "Another word about it, and you'll be riding out tomorrow." The warning silenced further speculation, but Charlotte had noted the immediate tension at the mere mention of land purchases. Whatever Hollister and his visitors were discussing involved transactions significant enough to require secrecy and protection. As the evening progressed, Charlotte made a show of retiring early, complaining of muscle strain from the fence work. In reality, she needed to prepare for whatever opportunities Swifthawk might provide. In the relative privacy of her bunk, she checked her pistol and positioned her knife for easy access beneath her pillow. Shortly after midnight, when most of the hands were asleep or deep in their cups, a soft scraping sound at the bunkhouse window nearest her bed alerted Charlotte. Swifthawk's face appeared briefly before vanishing again. The signal. She slipped from her bunk with practiced silence, easing past the sleeping forms of the other ranch hands. Years of moving through Boston boarding houses without waking fellow teachers had prepared her for this particular stealth, though the stakes now were infinitely higher. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the vast sky like diamond dust. Charlotte followed the shadows along the edge of the yard, moving toward the rendezvous point they had established behind the stables. Swifthawk awaited her, his expression grave. "They still talk," he reported without preamble. "The men drink whiskey and speak more freely now. Hollister has sent the house servants away, but I am to patrol the grounds." "How do we get close enough to hear?" Charlotte asked, adjusting her hat lower over her features despite the darkness. "The study has a window that faces the side garden," Swifthawk explained. "Below it, there is a drainage ditch covered by bushes. A person could lie there hidden and hear what is said inside. It was risky, perhaps foolishly so, but Charlotte hadn't come this far to retreat from opportunity." "And your role?" I will. Patrol visibly at the front of the house, then circle around to check behind the stables, creating time when the side garden will be unwatched. His planning was precise, considering variables Charlotte might have overlooked. If someone approaches, "While you listen, I will signal with an owl's call." They moved separately toward the main house, Swifthawk walking openly as part of his assigned duties, Charlotte keeping to shadows and using outbuildings for cover. The ranch was quieter now, most workers asleep or confined to the bunkhouse. Only 2 guards remained visible, stationed at the front entrance to the property rather than near the house itself. The side garden Swifthawk had described was well maintained compared to the functional practicality of the rest of the ranch, evidence of Hollister's aspirations beyond mere cattle ranching. Ornamental bushes lined a gravel path, providing excellent cover for Charlotte as she located the drainage ditch beneath the study window. The ground was cold and damp as she positioned herself in the shallow depression, pulling a branch of decorative sage across her form for additional concealment. Through the partially opened window above, yellow lamplight spilled out along with the rumble of male voices and the acrid scent of cigar smoke. The surveys confirm rich deposits extending at least 8 miles into the reservation lands, Hollister was saying, his voice clear enough for Charlotte to distinguish. With the new boundary adjustments, we can legally claim 50% of it. Legal, by whose determination? This voice was unfamiliar, cultured with an Eastern accent. The Treaty of 68 is quite specific about those boundaries. Treaties can be reinterpreted, Colonel Forsyth replied with casual dismissal, particularly when certain officials are properly motivated to recognize errors in the original surveys. Laughter followed, the comfortable mirth of men accustomed to bending rules to their advantage. Charlotte's fingers dug into the cold earth as she controlled her breathing, focusing on capturing every word. The problem remains enforcement, the Eastern voice continued. The Indian agent at Fort Laramie has proven resistant to our overtures. Agents who can be replaced, Hollister replied confidently. Just as sheriffs can be when they become inconvenient. Blackwater has been much more accommodating since we resolved that particular obstacle. Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs. Here was confirmation of what she had suspected. Hollister openly acknowledging his role in removing her brother as an obstacle to their plans. That situation was regrettable but necessary, Forsyth added. Hawkins was collecting evidence that could have reached federal authorities. The documents Red Feather carried alone would have been damaging if properly translated. Which reminds me, the older man spoke for the first time, his voice heavy with authority. Your Sioux tracker, can he be trusted? Having a native so close to these discussions seems unwise. Swifthawk serves me because I control access to hunting grounds his family depends upon, Hollister answered with smug confidence. He can't read English and knows his people's survival depends on my continued goodwill. Besides, he's useful, knows this territory better than any white scout. The irony of Hollister's miscalculation would have been satisfying under different circumstances. Now, it simply confirmed what Charlotte and Swifthawk had separately concluded. These men operated from a position of such privilege and power that they couldn't conceive of effective opposition from those they considered beneath them. The conversation shifted to specific figures: investments required, profits projected, bribes necessary to secure various officials' cooperation. Charlotte committed as much as possible to memory, recognizing that this evidence, if she could somehow document it, would implicate not just in her brother's murder, but in a conspiracy reaching into territorial government. As the men began discussing a planned meeting with territorial officials in Clearwater Junction the following week, Charlotte sensed movement nearby. Before she could react, a hand clamped firmly over her mouth from behind. Her body tensed to fight, but a familiar, voice whispered against her ear. "Jenkins!" Swifthawk breathed, so quietly she barely heard. Coming around the corner. Heart pounding, Charlotte remained perfectly still as Swifthawk's body provided additional cover among the bushes. Through the narrow gap between sage branches, she could see the foreman's boots as he passed within feet of their position, pausing briefly to light a cigarette before continuing his circuit of the house. Once Jenkins had moved beyond hearing range, Swifthawk eased his hand from her mouth. "We must go," he whispered. "They will conclude soon, and more guards will check the grounds." Charlotte nodded, processing both their narrow escape and the damning information she had gathered. As they prepared to retreat, one final exchange drifted through the window above. "And the Sioux who continue to resist?" Forsyth asked. "The young warriors who don't accept these new arrangements? A regrettable conflict appears inevitable," Hollister replied, satisfaction evident in his tone. "When it occurs, the army will have no choice but to respond decisively. The resulting boundaries will be even more favorable to our interests." "Deliberately provoking an uprising?" The Eastern voice sounded momentarily concerned. "That carries significant risk." "Controlled risk," Forsyth corrected. "We've positioned supplies to arm specific bands known for their aggression. Once they strike at white settlements, public opinion will demand action. I still have considerable influence with my former command." This final revelation sent a chill through Charlotte that had nothing to do with the cold ground. These men weren't simply stealing land through fraudulent means. They were orchestrating a conflict that would cost countless lives on both sides, all to advance their financial interests. Swifthawk's face, visible in the faint moonlight as they crept away from the house, showed that he had heard the same exchange. The implications for his people were devastating. They retreated in tense silence, using the shadows and outbuildings for cover until they reached the relative safety of the stables. Only there, certain they were alone, did Charlotte speak. "They're planning to trigger a war," she whispered, the horror of it settling into her bones, "using your people as pawns." Swifthawk's expression remained controlled, but tension radiated from his body. "Such rumors have reached our elders. Now we have confirmation." He turned to face Charlotte directly. "This goes beyond your brother's murder or our stolen lands. Many will die if they succeed." The scope of the conspiracy had expanded far beyond what Charlotte had imagined when she first adopted her disguise and headed west seeking justice. What had begun as a personal quest for vengeance had transformed into something far more significant and dangerous. "We need evidence others will believe," she said, mind racing through possibilities. "My word alone won't stand against men like Hollister and Forsyth, and no court would accept testimony from a Sioux," Swifthawk finished with grim acknowledgement, "or from a woman disguised as a man carrying her own deceptions." The truth of their shared predicament hung between them. Both were witnesses to a terrible conspiracy, yet both were compromised in ways that would undermine their credibility. "With authorities, the meeting in Clearwater Junction," Charlotte said suddenly. "If they're bringing territorial officials into their scheme, they'll need documents, maps, surveys, contracts, physical evidence we could obtain." Swifthawk considered. "This 3 days' ride from here, I know the paths that would get us there unnoticed." The word "us" hung in the air, a partnership neither had explicitly agreed to, but that circumstances now demanded. Charlotte extended her hand, an offer of alliance that transcended their different worlds. "My brother died trying to protect your people's lands and enforce the law," she said. "I came for justice for Thomas, but this is larger than one man's death now." Swifthawk clasped her hand firmly. "And I sought to protect my people's future. It seems our paths joined toward the same destination." As they solidified their plans, Charlotte Hawkins realized that her quest had irrevocably transformed. The disguise she had adopted for vengeance now served a greater purpose, and the alliance she had formed with Swifthawk represented something her brother would have valued: cooperation across divisions that men like Hollister exploited for. Prophet Dawn would bring new challenges and the need for careful deception as they prepared to leave the Silver Dollar while maintaining their cover. But for the first time since receiving news of Thomas's murder, Charlotte felt something beyond grief and anger driving her forward, a sense of purpose that honored her brother's commitment to justice rather than merely avenging his death. The following day moved with agonizing slowness as Charlotte maintained her role as Charlie Hawkins' ranch hand. Her mind worked through escape scenarios while her hands automatically completed assigned tasks: mending tack, relocating cattle to fresh grazing land, and repairing a damaged section of corral fencing. Each mundane action served as cover while she mentally catalogued supplies they would need and potential complications they might face. Jenkins appeared mid-morning, eyeing the new hands with particular scrutiny. "Hollister wants 4 men to accompany a shipment to Coyote Springs tomorrow," he announced. "Hawkins, you're on the detail." Charlotte nodded, concealing her alarm. Coyote Springs lay in the opposite direction from Clearwater Junction, where the territorial officials would be meeting with Hollister and his conspirators. Being assigned to this detail would make their planned departure impossible. "Problem with that, Jenkins," Swifthawk's voice came from behind the foreman. He approached, leading a limping horse, its front left leg clearly injured. "Found this. One in the north pasture. Stepped in a prairie dog hole. Need someone who knows horses to treat it properly while I track the rest of the scattered herd." Jenkins frowned, looking between the injured horse and Charlotte. Hawkins claimed experience with horse ailments when I hired him on. Swifthawk's face remained impassive. Many claim skills they do not possess. The challenge was clear, forcing Jenkins to either question Charlotte's claimed abilities or reassign her to prove them. Pride won out, as Swifthawk had clearly anticipated. "Fine. Hawkins, you handle this horse. I want it sound enough to sell by next month." Jenkins redirected his attention to another hand for the Coyote Springs detail, leaving Charlotte with the perfect assignment, one that would keep her near the stables and provide cover for gathering supplies. As Jenkins walked away, Charlotte led the injured horse into the stable. "Clever," she murmured when Swifthawk followed. "Is the horse actually hurt?" "Temporarily," he replied, showing her where he had packed clay around the hoof to simulate lameness. "It will recover remarkably well by tomorrow." They worked side by side, maintaining the charade while speaking quietly about their plans. With Hollister and his guests departing that afternoon for Clearwater Junction, the ranch would operate with reduced supervision, creating their opportunity. "I've hidden supplies near the East Ravine," Swifthawk explained as he handed her brushes for the horse's coat. "Enough food for 4 days, ammunition, extra water skins." Charlotte nodded, appreciating his foresight. "We'll need to leave separately. Tonight. I'll go first, after midnight. You follow when you can without drawing attention." "The night guard rotates at 2, he confirmed. "I can leave then without suspicion." As darkness fell, Charlotte focused on appearing normal during the evening meal, losing a few hands of poker deliberately and retiring to her bunk at the usual time. Inside her bedroll, fully dressed with her boots wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, she waited as the bunkhouse gradually quieted. Midnight came and went as she monitored the breathing patterns of the men around her, ensuring they were deeply asleep before making her move. With practiced silence, she slipped from her bunk, collecting her minimal possessions and the small bundle of supplies she had accumulated throughout the day. The night air carried the scent of sage and wood smoke as she emerged from the bunkhouse, keeping to shadows as she moved toward the stables. Her roan gelding nickered softly in recognition as she approached his stall. Working by touch in the darkness, she saddled him with careful movements to minimize noise, then led him out through the back entrance where harder ground would leave. Fewer tracks. Only when she had put half a mile between herself and the ranch did Charlotte mount, urging the horse to a steady trot toward the meeting point Swifthawk had designated. The night sky spread vast and brilliant above her, stars illuminating the landscape enough to follow the faint trail through scrubland and scattered pines. The east ravine appeared as a darker slash in the landscape, a narrow cut through ancient rock that provided both concealment and access to a hidden spring. Charlotte dismounted, leading her horse carefully down the steep path to the hidden grove where Swifthawk had cached their supplies. The wait stretched nearly 2 hours, each sound from the wilderness triggering heightened alertness. Had he been discovered, prevented from leaving, or worse, had the entire arrangement been an elaborate trap orchestrated by Hollister? Doubt crept in as time passed, Charlotte's hand never straying far from her holstered Colt. A soft whicker from her horse alerted her to approaching movement seconds before Swifthawk materialized from the darkness, leading his paint stallion. Relief flooded through her, though she maintained her composure. "Any complications?" she asked, as he secured his mount beside hers. "None. The night guard believes I am tracking a mountain lion that's been troubling the north herd." He untied a leather bundle from his saddle, revealing additional supplies, including, Charlotte noted with surprise, a dress carefully folded among the provisions. Catching her questioning glance, Swifthawk explained, "Where we travel, a white man draws attention. A white woman traveling with a Sioux scout will be remembered by everyone who sees us. But a white woman traveling with her Sioux husband passes notice in territories where such pairings exist." Charlotte's eyebrows rose at the suggestion, but she couldn't fault the logic. 2 figures traveling alone would certainly draw attention. A disguised woman and a Sioux tracker, both connected to Hollister's ranch, would be particularly memorable if pursuit was organized. But a mixed couple, while unusual, would attract less suspicion. "Husband and wife," she repeated, testing the concept. "That's our new disguise?" Swifthawk's expression remained neutral. "Unless you have a better suggestion for traversing 3 days of territory where both of us would be hunted if recognized." She didn't. The plan offered practical protection through social assumptions. "I haven't worn a dress in 6 months, she said instead, accepting the necessity. "It will feel strange. No stranger than binding your chest and lowering your voice," he replied pragmatically. "We leave our old disguises to adopt new ones. The destination remains the same." They departed before dawn, Swifthawk leading them along game trails and dry creek beds that would hide their tracks from all but the most determined pursuers. Charlotte had changed into the simple calico dress, securing her pistol in a pocket sewn into the skirts, an adaptation that felt both foreign and familiar after months in men's clothing. As the sun rose, Charlotte studied their surroundings with new appreciation. Their path took them through landscapes rarely seen by settlers, hidden valleys where wildflowers carpeted meadows between towering rock formations, narrow passages through stone that opened unexpectedly into verdant oases, fed by underground springs. "The white maps don't show these places," Swifthawk explained when she commented on a particularly beautiful canyon. "The survey teams follow open routes. They miss what lies between." "Like the surveyors Hollister mentioned? The ones marking indigenous lands for mining claims," Swifthawk nodded grimly. "They measure what can be sold and ignore what should be protected. My grandfather showed me these paths when I was a boy. He said knowledge of the land's secrets might someday save our people." Charlotte considered the revelation that Swifthawk's cooperation with Hollister had been an elaborate deception, the ultimate infiltration by someone the rancher fundamentally underestimated. "How long have you been watching them, learning their plans?" 2 winters, he replied. "After Red Feather was killed attempting to bring evidence to your brother, our council decided we needed eyes within the enemy's camp. I had traded with white settlers, learned enough of their language and ways to move among them. It was decided I would be most suitable. And Hollister believed you served him out of necessity, because he controlled hunting grounds? A hint of grim amusement touched Swifthawk's features. Men like Hollister understand only power and submission. They cannot conceive that those they consider inferior might possess equal intelligence or greater patience. By midday, they had covered impressive distance, the Silver Dollar Ranch far behind them, as they traversed increasingly rugged country. Swifthawk set a pace that balanced speed with caution, avoiding open spaces where they might be spotted from a distance, yet maintaining steady progress toward Clearwater Junction. They stopped briefly to rest the horses near a sheltered spring, sharing dried meat and hardtack from their provisions. Charlotte used the opportunity to study their crude map, comparing Swifthawk's knowledge of hidden routes with the more conventional paths that Hollister and his associates would likely follow. "They'll take the stage road," she reasoned, tracing the established route with her finger. "Faster and suitable for carriages. Their meeting is scheduled for 2 days from now." Swifthawk nodded agreement. "They will reach Clearwater Junction tomorrow evening. We will arrive by noon the same day, taking the Mesa Passage." He indicated a route that cut directly through terrain most travelers would avoid. "It will give us time to prepare." As they continued their journey through the afternoon, Charlotte found herself adjusting to their new dynamic. No longer the solitary avenger or even the disguised ranch hand, but part of a partnership formed through shared purpose rather than choice. Swifthawk's movements showed years of experience reading the land, identifying potential dangers before they materialized, finding water where none seemed possible. When they made camp that evening in the shelter of a sandstone overhang, Charlotte finally asked the question that had been forming throughout the day. How does someone with your skills and intelligence end up working for a man like Hollister? Even as a spy, the risk was enormous. Swifthawk was silent for a long moment, feeding small twigs into their carefully concealed fire. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of difficult history. 4 years ago, I studied at the white man's school in Pennsylvania. The government took children from many tribes, believing they could civilize us. His tone made clear the bitterness this policy had engendered. I learned their language, their writing, their laws. I thought this knowledge would help my people navigate the new reality being forced upon us. Charlotte listened, surprised by this revelation that contradicted Hollister's assumption about Swifthawk's literacy and education. "When I returned," he continued, "I found treaties being broken faster than they were written, Indian agents promising protection while allowing our hunting grounds to be invaded. My education meant nothing against their greed." He looked up, meeting Charlotte's gaze directly. "So I became what they expected, the silent, useful native who could track and hunt but posed no intellectual threat." "You hid your true abilities," Charlotte observed, recognizing a parallel to her own deception. "As I hid my gender." "We both wear masks," he agreed. "Mine allows me to gather information they would never share in the presence of an educated Indian. Yours allowed you to pursue justice in a world that would have dismissed a woman's quest." The simple truth of this observation resonated deeply. Both had adopted disguises necessitated by a society that undervalued them based on immutable characteristics, rather than ability or character. "My brother would have appreciated your methods," Charlotte said after a contemplative silence. "Thomas believed in working within the law, but he wasn't naive about how powerful men manipulated it. That's what got him killed, understanding too clearly how Hollister and his allies were corrupting territorial officials." Swifthawk added another small branch to their fire. "Your brother tried to protect my people's messenger. For that alone, he deserved better than a bullet in the back." "Tell me about Red Feather," Charlotte requested. What evidence was he carrying that was so dangerous to Hollister? Maps, Swifthawk replied. Not white men's drawings, but our people's knowledge recorded by Red Feather after consulting with elders. They showed the true boundaries established in the treaty, marked with natural features that couldn't be disputed, and documents, papers signed by a former Indian agent acknowledging fraudulent adjustments to reservation boundaries ordered by investors from the east. Charlotte processed this information, connecting it with what they'd overheard at Hollister's meeting. Papers that would have exposed the entire scheme, she concluded, if my brother had received them and forwarded them to federal authorities in Washington. Instead, Red Feather was killed before reaching Blackwater, and your brother was murdered. Days later, Swifthawk's expression grew distant. Two men seeking justice, silenced by those who profit from its absence. The parallel deaths of men from vastly different cultures, united in their opposition to corruption, underscored the unusual alliance Charlotte and Swifthawk had formed. Whatever barriers might normally have separated them, gender, culture, background, had been superseded by their shared mission to expose a conspiracy that had claimed both of their kinsmen. As darkness deepened around their small camp, Charlotte felt a strange sense of clarity emerging from their conversation. Her disguise as Charlie Hawkins had been a necessary tool, but it had also been a form of hiding, not just from potential enemies, but from the vulnerability of being herself in a world that had taken everything she valued. Tomorrow, we reach Clearwater Junction, she said, returning to practical matters. What do we know about where this meeting will take place? Swifthawk reached for a stick, sketching a rough layout in the dirt beside their fire. The town has one hotel, the Clearwater House, 2 stories, with private dining rooms on the second floor where sensitive business is conducted. Hollister and Forsyth will likely secure one of these rooms, and the territorial officials, would they stay at the same hotel? Judge Morrison and Commissioner Blackwell. Swifthawk provided their names with certitude that surprised Charlotte. They will arrive separately to maintain appearances of impartiality. The commissioner usually stays with his cousin, who owns the dry goods store. Charlotte studied his face with newfound appreciation. Your network of information extends beyond the silver dollar. A slight smile touched Swifthawk's usually stoic features. My people have eyes and ears throughout the territory. Many who work in white establishments are invisible to their employers, free to observe and report what they witness. This revelation opened new possibilities. Do you have contacts in Clearwater Junction? People who might help us? The laundress at the hotel is married to a man of my tribe. She sees documents left carelessly in pockets, hears conversations through doors while delivering linens, and her position gives her access to most rooms when guests are absent. A strategy began taking shape in Charlotte's mind. If we could get access to Hollister's papers, the ones he'll bring to convince these officials to support his scheme. The wire hotel's rear entrance leads directly to the laundry, Swifthawk confirmed, following her thinking. During busy periods, many come and go without notice. Their plan evolved through careful discussion. Charlotte would pose as the laundress's new assistant, granting her access to the hotel's interior without suspicion. Swifthawk would maintain watch from outside, positioned to warn of approaching danger or create diversions if necessary. The challenge would be timing their infiltration to coincide with Hollister's absence from his room, yet before the critical meeting occurred. As they extinguished their small fire and prepared for sleep, Charlotte felt a curious sense of anticipation, replacing the raw anger that had driven her for months. The prospect of exposing her brother's killers through evidence rather than violence offered a form of justice Thomas himself would have pursued, one that addressed the broader corruption that had made his murder possible. We should reach Clearwater by midday tomorrow, Swifthawk said as they settled beneath the stone overhang, positioned to allow clear sight of approaching danger from any direction. Rest now. The most dangerous part of our journey begins when we enter town. Charlotte nodded, though sleep seemed unlikely given the thoughts racing through her mind. She had spent months perfecting her disguise as Charlie Hawkins, learning to move and speak as a man would. Tomorrow would require a different performance, returning to feminine mannerisms and speech while maintaining the watchful alertness that had kept her alive in hostile territory. "Swifthawk," she said quietly, as darkness enveloped their camp. "If we succeed, if we obtain evidence that exposes this conspiracy, what happens to your people? Will it be enough to protect the lands Hollister covets?" He was silent for a long moment, the question clearly touching on uncertainties he had carried throughout his mission. "Papers alone cannot stop bullets," he finally answered, "but they can change which way guns are pointed. If federal authorities intervene against Hollister rather than against my people, many lives might be saved." It was a measured response, neither overly optimistic nor despairing. Charlotte recognized in it the careful balance Swifthawk himself maintained, working within white society systems when necessary, while harboring no illusions about their fundamental fairness to his people. "My brother believed the law could protect everyone if applied properly," she reflected. "He died holding that belief." "And yet you came west, seeking vengeance outside the law," Swifthawk observed without judgment. Charlotte hadn't considered this contradiction, but recognized its truth immediately. "Perhaps we both need to find a path between our instincts and our ideals," she acknowledged. "Justice that honors those we've lost without becoming what we oppose." As scattered clouds drifted across the star-filled sky, Charlotte felt an unexpected sense of connection, not just to her brother's memory or her mission, but to this unusual ally who had recognized her deception yet chosen to trust her anyway. Tomorrow would test that trust as they entered Clearwater Junction and attempted to penetrate Hollister's carefully guarded plans. For the first time since receiving news of Thomas's murder, Charlotte found herself considering what might come. If they succeeded, if Hollister and his conspirators faced consequences for their actions, if the immediate threat to Swifthawk's people was averted, what would remain for a woman who had abandoned her former life and spent months disguised as someone else? Or for a man whose careful infiltration of enemy territory would necessarily end once his role was exposed? These questions remained unanswered, as exhaustion finally overcame vigilance, drawing Charlotte into uneasy sleep beneath the vast western sky. Tomorrow would bring them to Clearwater Junction, and to the confrontation they had both been working toward through separate paths that had unexpectedly converged. The final leg of their journey toward town carried a weight of anticipation that made each mile seem longer than the last. By mid-morning, they could see smoke from Clearwater Junction's chimneys rising against distant mountains. The settlement was larger than Charlotte had expected, a proper town rather than the scattered collection of buildings that constituted many frontier communities. "From here, we are who we appear to be," Swifthawk reminded her as they approached. "Husband and wife traveling to visit your cousin who works at the hotel, nothing more." Charlotte nodded, conscious of how differently she sat on her horse now, no longer mimicking the careless posture of a ranch hand, but adopting the more careful seat expected of a woman. 6 months of deception had made her acutely aware of how appearance shaped others' perceptions, and how those perceptions could provide either protection or danger. "I find myself wondering," she said, as they rode the final stretch toward town, "which disguise is more restrictive, pretending to be a man to gain freedom of movement, or returning to being a woman bound by society's limitations?" Swifthawk considered this philosophical question with characteristic seriousness. Perhaps the greatest freedom lies in moving between worlds, understanding both without being entirely claimed by either. As the buildings of Clearwater Junction came into clear view, Charlotte adjusted her bonnet and straightened her shoulders, preparing for their next performance and for the confrontation with Hollister that might finally bring justice for her brother and Swifthawk's kinsman. "Ready?" Swifthawk asked as they approached the town's main street. Charlotte nodded, her hand briefly touching the hidden Colt in her dress pocket, a reminder that beneath this new disguise remained the determination that had carried her across half a continent seeking truth. "Ready?" Clearwater Junction hummed with the energy of a growing frontier settlement. Unlike the ramshackle appearance of many territorial outposts, the town displayed aspirations toward permanence. Brick buildings alongside wooden structures, painted storefronts, and boardwalks elevating pedestrians above the muddy street. Charlotte noted these details with the analytical eye she had developed during months of observation and survival. The Clearwater House dominated the town center, a two-story hotel with pretensions of grandeur evident in its columned porch and large windows. Beside it stood the expected frontier businesses, general store, gunsmith, land office, saloon, all arranged around a central square where a territorial flag flapped lazily in the midday breeze. Swifthawk guided their horses toward the livery stable at the town's edge, maintaining the careful distance a husband might keep, close enough for propriety, yet not so familiar as to draw attention. Hollister's men typically arrive before him to secure rooms and ensure safety, he murmured as they dismounted. "We may already be watched." Charlotte nodded almost imperceptibly, her gaze casually scanning the street while she adjusted her skirts. "The hotel's rear entrance?" Through the alley beside the gunsmith, Swifthawk handed their horses to the stable hand with a few coins. "I'll make contact with our ally while you establish yourself near the hotel. The laundress expects someone seeking work. She won't know it's you specifically." They separated with practiced casualness, Swifthawk heading toward the edge of town where mixed-race families typically resided, while Charlotte made her way toward the hotel. She moved with deliberate purpose, adopting the slightly hurried gait of a woman with legitimate business rather than the cautious movements of someone attempting stealth. The hotel's main entrance featured double doors opening onto a lobby furnished with aspirational elegance, worn but respectable furniture, a reception desk manned by a balding clerk, and stairs leading to the second floor where the private dining rooms and better accommodations were located. Charlotte passed by without entering, noting instead the delivery entrance at the building's rear. Steam billowed from the laundry facility attached to the hotel's back section, carrying the sharp scent of lye soap and starch. Two women worked in the open doorway, hanging sheets on lines stretched across the narrow yard, their faces flushed from heat and exertion. "Excuse me," Charlotte approached with carefully calibrated hesitancy. "I was told you might need help with the washing. My husband and I have just arrived in town, and I'm looking for work while he seeks mining employment." The older woman paused, wiping perspiration from her brow with a forearm. Her assessment of Charlotte was quick but thorough, taking in her modest dress, capable hands, and direct gaze. Whatever she saw apparently satisfied her. "Timing's fortunate," she replied. "My girl left to get married last week, and we've got a full house upstairs with some fancy Eastern types arriving today." Her dark eyes held a flicker of acknowledgement that suggested Swifthawk had indeed made prior arrangements. "I'm Mrs. Whitehorse. Laundry experience?" 3 years at a boarding house in Boston, Charlotte supplied the background they had constructed. "I can handle fine linens and remove difficult stains." Mrs. Whitehorse nodded. "Start with those shirts. They belong to Judge Morrison's clerk and need pressing before the meeting tonight." She gestured toward a basket of damp clothing. "Irons are heating inside. I pay 40 cents a day, no meals." Charlotte accepted the meager wage without comment, recognizing that the real payment would be access to the hotel's interior and proximity to Hollister's rooms. Within an hour, she had established her position, pressing garments in the laundry room that adjoined the kitchen, listening to staff conversations while appearing focused solely on her work. Sending up whiskey to the gentleman in room 4. The cook was telling a young serving boy, "Mind your manners, that's Colonel Forsyth, and he's particular about how he's addressed." Charlotte filed away the room number, continuing her methodical pressing while absorbing every detail. By mid-afternoon, she had compiled considerable intelligence. Hollister occupied room 6 at the end of the hall, Forsyth was in room 4, and Judge Morrison had taken room 2, maintaining the appearance of separation while ensuring convenient access. To their private discussions, Mrs. Whitehorse, the hotel manager, appeared in the doorway, his manner officiously important. "The gentlemen in rooms 4 and 6 will be dining privately in the upstairs meeting room at 7. They require fresh linens for the table and someone to build up the fire before they arrive." "I'll see to it myself," Mrs. Whitehorse assured him, waiting until he departed before catching Charlotte's eye. "Or perhaps our new girl might handle it. Good opportunity to learn the upstairs layout." The deliberate suggestion confirmed Charlotte's suspicion that Mrs. Whitehorse was indeed swift. Hawk's contact, facilitating their infiltration with subtle precision. "Happy to help wherever needed," Charlotte replied with appropriate deference. Shortly before 5 o'clock, Charlotte carried freshly pressed table linens up the back stairs, a hotel maid's apron now covering her dress. The upper floor was quiet. Most guests either out on business or resting before dinner. She moved efficiently toward the private dining room, passing the numbered guest rooms with careful attention to their locations. The private dining room was unoccupied, allowing Charlotte to work without observation as she replaced the table linens and built up the fire as instructed. While arranging the fireplace tools, she noted something crucial: a connecting door between this room and what appeared to be a small study or office, currently unlocked. Investigation of this adjoining room revealed a writing desk positioned beneath windows overlooking the town square, bookshelves containing legal volumes, and most importantly, a leather portfolio bearing the territorial seal. Charlotte's pulse quickened as she recognized the opportunity presented. Official documents prepared for the evening's meeting, temporarily unattended while the participants prepared themselves in their individual rooms. A quick examination of the portfolio's contents confirmed her hopes. Survey maps with boundaries clearly altered from their original markings, land transfer agreements awaiting signatures, and most damning of all, a memorandum detailing security arrangements for removing obstacles to development in specific territories. The clinical language couldn't disguise the proposal's true nature, a coordinated military action against Sioux bands who continued to resist Hollister's encroachment on treaty lands. Charlotte lacked time to read everything thoroughly, but the document's existence confirmed what they'd overheard at the ranch. She needed Swifthawk to see these papers to determine which would provide the most compelling evidence of the conspiracy. But removing them now would alert Hollister to the breach before they could act. Footsteps in the hallway forced Charlotte to retreat, closing the connecting door as she returned to her assigned tasks in the dining room. She completed her work and departed down the back stairs, mind racing with possibilities. The meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock, giving them precious little time to formulate a plan. In the laundry room, Charlotte found Swifthawk waiting, dressed now as a hotel porter, a disguise that allowed him limited access to the building's public areas. Mrs. Whitehorse had conveniently found errands elsewhere, giving them privacy to confer. "They have documented everything," Charlotte reported in hurried whispers, describing the portfolio's contents: military plans, falsified surveys, even mentions of resolving the sheriff situation in Blackwater County. "It's all there in black and white, but we can't simply take it. They'd know immediately." Swifthawk processed this information with characteristic focus. We need to duplicate what we can, then ensure the originals reach federal authorities rather than territorial ones who might be compromised. The U.S. Marshal in Fort Richardson would act on such evidence, Charlotte agreed. He worked with Thomas on several cases and respected him, but he's 3 days' ride from here, and Hollister's meeting starts in less than 2 hours. They quickly refined their strategy. Charlotte would return to prepare the room for dinner service, creating an opportunity to access the documents again. Swifthawk had brought thin tracing paper, commonly used by surveyors, which would allow them to copy the most incriminating maps and passages without removing the originals. Mrs. Whitehorse would ensure they had legitimate reasons to access the upper floor throughout the evening. What about after? Charlotte asked as they finalized details. Once we have copies, Hollister will still proceed with his plans unless stopped. Swifthawk's expression hardened. There's a U.S. Army patrol camped 10 miles south of town. I observed them on our approach, led by Captain Reynolds, known for his strict adherence to federal authority over territorial governance. If we could get evidence to him before Hollister's group disperses, the laundress's son rides for the Pony Express, Swifthawk confirmed. He can deliver our evidence to Reynolds tonight, bringing forces here by morning. Their plan took shape with urgent precision. Charlotte would secure copies while Swifthawk arranged for their swift delivery to Captain Reynolds. If everything aligned perfectly, federal authorities could intercept Hollister, Forsyth, and their territorial accomplices with evidence of conspiracy in their possession. As evening approached, Charlotte returned upstairs with fresh towels for the private dining room, her pretext for accessing the area before the meeting. The hotel hummed with increased activity, guests returning from daily business, while kitchen staff prepared elaborate meals for those dining in-house. She worked efficiently, arranging towels and checking that everything appeared in order, waiting for the corridor to clear before slipping into the adjoining study. The portfolio remained on the desk, apparently untouched since her earlier discovery. Working with swift precision, Charlotte extracted the most damning documents and laid the tracing paper over them, using a pencil to create rough but legible copies of maps, signatures, and key passages that explicitly outlined the conspiracy. The door opening in the main corridor sent adrenaline coursing through her system. Charlotte quickly returned the originals to their exact positions, concealing her copied pages within the folds of spare linens she carried. She had nearly reached the connecting door when it opened from the other side. Colonel Forsyth stood, framed in the doorway, his imposing height and military bearing momentarily frozen in surprise at finding someone in the private study. His eyes narrowed, taking in Charlotte's maid's apron and the linens in her arms. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded, suspicion evident in his tone. Charlotte dropped into a small curtsy, adopting the deferential manner expected of hotel staff. "Begging your pardon, sir. Manager sent me to build up the fires and bring fresh linens for your meeting. Wasn't sure which room needed attending." Forsyth studied her with the calculating assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating threats. For a terrifying moment, Charlotte feared her disguise had failed, that something in her bearing or speech had betrayed her as more than a simple hotel maid. "This room is private," he stated coldly. "You should have knocked." "Yes, sir. My apologies, sir." Charlotte kept her gaze appropriately lowered, though every instinct screamed to watch his hands, to monitor for any movement toward the weapon she suspected he carried. After an excruciating pause, Forsyth stepped aside. "See that we're not disturbed once the meeting begins. Mr. Hollister values his privacy." "Of course, sir." Charlotte slipped past him, feeling his eyes following her as she moved toward the back stairs with measured steps that betrayed none of the urgency pounding through her veins. In the relative safety of the laundry room, Charlotte transferred the traced documents to Swifthawk, who had prepared a waterproof packet for their journey to Captain Reynolds. The laundress's son, a wiry youth with determined eyes, waited by the back door, dressed for hard riding. "These must reach Captain Reynolds tonight," Swifthawk instructed, placing the packet in the boy's hands. "Tell him they come from Swift, Hawk of the Standing Rock Band, and concern territorial security requiring immediate attention." The boy nodded, apparently accustomed to carrying messages of significance. "I know where they're camped. I'll find them." As he disappeared into the gathering dusk, Charlotte and Swifthawk exchanged glances of grim determination. "Now we wait," she said quietly. "Now we prepare," Swifthawk corrected. "Hollister and Forsyth are not men who accept defeat without violence. When they realize they've been exposed, they'll seek escape and elimination of witnesses." Charlotte touched the hidden Colt in her pocket. "Then we'll be ready when they do." The evening progressed with excruciating slowness, tension building beneath the ordinary activities of the hotel. From her position in the laundry, Charlotte caught glimpses of the main street through windows, noting the positions of Hollister's men stationed at strategic points. 2 at the hotel's front entrance, another watching from the saloon across the street, a 4th patrolling casually behind the building. Mrs. Whitehorse provided updates when possible, reporting that the gentlemen had gathered in the private dining room and requested not to be disturbed until they rang for service. The meeting that would have solidified their control over vast territories and resources was proceeding exactly as planned, while evidence of their crimes raced toward federal authorities who could end their conspiracy permanently. Near midnight, the relative quiet was broken by the sounds of chairs, scraping and raised voices from the upper floor. Charlotte and Swifthawk exchanged glances, recognizing the change in atmosphere that suggested their intervention might have been discovered. "They're preparing to leave," Mrs. Whitehorse reported after a quick reconnaissance. "Something spooked them. They've sent for their horses to be readied immediately." Swifthawk moved toward the door. "Reynolds must have mobilized more quickly than we anticipated. Hollister likely has informants among local residents who've warned him of troops approaching. If they escape before the army arrives," Charlotte began. "They won't," Swifthawk assured her, checking the revolver concealed beneath his porter's jacket. "I'll delay their horses. Position yourself where you can observe without being seen." The next hour unfolded with the chaotic energy of plans, unraveling from multiple directions. Hollister's group attempted a hasty departure, only to find mysterious delays with their mounts. Military hoofbeats approached from the south edge of town, prompting Forsyth to separate from Hollister, apparently hoping to evade capture individually, rather than collectively. Charlotte maintained her position near the hotel's side entrance, watching as Hollister emerged with the damning portfolio clutched under his arm, his expression transformed from confident power broker to hunted criminal. As he moved toward the alley where his horse should have been waiting, she stepped into his path. "Looking for justice, Mr. Hollister?" she asked, her natural voice emerging for the first time in this man's presence. He halted, confusion evident, as he tried to place her face in the dim light. "Get out of my way, woman!" "My brother was Thomas Hawkins," Charlotte continued, removing her maid's bonnet to reveal her features more clearly. "The sheriff of Blackwater County. The obstacle you had removed." Recognition dawned in Hollister's eyes, followed immediately by calculation. His hand moved toward his coat, but Charlotte had anticipated this reaction. Her Colt appeared in her hand, the months of practice ensuring it cleared her pocket smoothly. "I wouldn't," she advised, her aim steady. "I've had 6 months to plan. This moment, and unlike your hired guns, I wouldn't shoot a man in the back." Hollister's expression hardened. "Hawkins had a sister back east, a school teacher." "He did?" Charlotte acknowledged. She came west seeking truth about her brother's murder, found considerably more than she expected. The sound of approaching riders grew louder. Captain Reynolds and his men entering the town from the south. while additional hoofbeats suggested others might be circling to block escape routes. "Whatever you think you know," Hollister began, his tone shifting to persuasive reason, "I can make it worth your while to forget it. A woman alone in the territories. You must understand practical necessities." Charlotte's finger remained steady on the trigger. "The practical necessity is justice, Mr. Hollister, for my brother, for Redfeather, and for everyone whose lives your greed would destroy." Swifthawk appeared at the alley's entrance, effectively blocking Hollister's retreat in that direction. "The army has your associates," he reported calmly. "Forsyth attempted to flee, but was intercepted." Hollister's composure cracked, desperation replacing calculation. With sudden violence, he lunged forward, attempting to knock Charlotte aside while drawing his own weapon. She sidestepped with the practiced agility developed during months on the trail, maintaining her aim as he stumbled past her. "Drop your weapon, Hollister." Captain Reynolds's authoritative command cut through the night as he and two soldiers appeared at the street entrance to the alley, rifles trained on the cornered rancher. Surrounded and outmaneuvered, James Hollister, the man who had ordered Thomas Hawkins's murder and orchestrated a conspiracy that threatened countless lives, slowly raised his hands in surrender, the portfolio falling to the ground at his feet. As Reynolds's men secured the prisoner, the captain approached Charlotte with a mixture of confusion and respect. "Ma'am, I received some very interesting documents concerning this man and his associates. May I ask your involvement in this situation?" Charlotte holstered her pistol, feeling the weight of her brother's badge in her pocket, the one possession of his she had carried throughout her journey. "Captain, that's a rather long story, involving a murdered sheriff, territorial corruption, and a woman who had to become someone else to find justice." Reynolds nodded thoughtfully, glancing between Charlotte and Swifthawk with growing comprehension. "I believe the federal authorities will be very interested in hearing that story in full, Miss Hawkins," she supplied, reclaiming her true identity after months of disguise. "Charlotte Hawkins." The territorial courthouse in Fort Richardson stood as a symbol of federal authority, a substantial stone building with imposing columns that seemed transplanted from eastern cities rather than grown organically from frontier soil. For 3 days, its chambers had hosted extraordinary proceedings as Charlotte Hawkins, Swifthawk, and a parade of witnesses testified about the conspiracy that had nearly triggered a manufactured war for profit. Charlotte adjusted her collar. As she sat outside the judge's chambers on the third morning, the unfamiliar sensation of proper women's clothing still strange after months in men's attire. The blue dress, hastily commissioned from Fort Richardson's seamstress, represented her gradual transition back to her public identity, though she felt fundamentally changed from the Boston schoolteacher who had headed west seeking vengeance. "The judge is ready for you, Miss Hawkins," the clerk announced, opening the polished oak door to the private chambers. Judge Harold Whitman, sent specifically from Washington to oversee the case, sat behind a massive desk scattered with documents, extracted from Hollister's portfolio and corroborating evidence gathered in subsequent arrests. A man in his 60s with penetrating grey eyes and a reputation for incorruptibility, Whitman had listened to testimony with minimal commentary, his expressions revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Miss Hawkins, please sit." He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "I believe we've concluded the formal aspects of your testimony, but I have some additional questions of a more personal nature, if you'd indulge me." Charlotte sat with the straight-backed posture ingrained through years of teaching, though her hands betrayed tension as they clasped tightly in her lap. "Of course, Your Honor." Judge Whitman studied her thoughtfully. "You traveled across half the continent, adopted a male identity for 6 months, infiltrated the operation of dangerous men, and ultimately helped prevent both a criminal conspiracy and potential bloodshed between settlers and indigenous peoples." He stated this as simple fact rather than accusation or praise. "Most remarkable." "I did what was necessary to uncover the truth about my brother's murder," Charlotte replied carefully. "The broader implications only became clear as events unfolded." "Indeed." Whitman shuffled some papers, extracting what appeared to be a telegram. "I've received communications from your former employer in Boston, the Pemberley School for Young Ladies. They express concern about your extended absence and inquire whether federal authorities have news of your whereabouts." The mention of her previous life struck Charlotte with unexpected force. The structured world of lesson plans, chaperoned, walks, and carefully modulated voices seemed to belong to another person entirely. A woman who had never slept under stars with a loaded pistol beside her bedroll or faced armed men with steady determination. "I left rather abruptly after receiving news of Thomas's death," she acknowledged. "I imagine they've found a replacement for my position by now." "Most likely," Whitman agreed. "Which raises the question of your future plans, Miss Hawkins. The prosecution of Hollister, Forsyth, and their co-conspirators will continue for some time. Your testimony has been invaluable, but I cannot in good conscience keep you in protective custody indefinitely." Charlotte had been avoiding this very consideration. What came after justice? The single-minded purpose that had driven her westward had been fulfilled with Hollister's arrest. The disguise she had adopted no longer served any practical function, yet the thought of returning to Boston, to resuming her former life as if unchanged by her experiences, seemed impossible. "I'm not entirely sure, Your Honor," she admitted with uncharacteristic uncertainty. "I haven't allowed myself to think beyond ensuring my brother's killers faced consequences." Whitman's expression softened slightly. "Your brother was highly regarded by federal authorities. His reports on territorial corruption had already prompted an investigation from Washington, though tragically not swiftly enough to prevent his murder." This revelation surprised Charlotte. He never mentioned such an investigation in his letters. Sheriff Hawkins understood the dangers of his position. The less those around him knew, the safer they remained. Whitman extracted another document from his desk. "Which brings me to a rather unusual proposition that has been suggested by Marshal Gardner." Charlotte recognized the name of the U.S. Marshal who had worked with Thomas on several cases and had been among the first to review the evidence against Hollister's conspiracy. "The territorial governor has authorized creation of a special investigative office attached to the federal court, individuals with authority to examine allegations of corruption across county lines, particularly in regions where local law enforcement may be compromised." Whitman slid the document toward her. "Marshal Gardner has recommended you be considered for such a position." Charlotte stared at the official paper, momentarily speechless. "But I'm a woman," she finally stated, the obvious impediment to such an appointment. Whitman's eyebrow raised slightly. "A fact that did not prevent you from uncovering a conspiracy that male authorities had failed to address. Your gender would certainly present challenges. But this territory is evolving, Miss Hawkins. New approaches may be required to ensure justice reaches its furthest corners." The proposition was so unexpected that Charlotte struggled to formulate a coherent response. "I have no formal legal training," she objected. "My background is in education. You have demonstrated investigative instincts, courage under pressure, and an uncommon dedication to justice. Qualities more valuable than technical knowledge, which can be acquired." Whitman leaned back in his chair. "Consider it merely a possibility at this juncture. The appointment would not be formalized until after the current proceedings conclude." As Charlotte left the judge's chambers, her mind whirled with implications. The document she carried, a preliminary offer of appointment as a special investigator, represented a future she had never imagined possible. Rather than returning to the rigid constraints of Eastern society, she might forge an entirely new path, one that honored Thomas's legacy while acknowledging the person she had become during her journey. The fort's central courtyard hummed with activity, soldiers drilling, supply wagons being unloaded, civilians conducting business with military authorities. At the far edge, beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree, Swifthawk waited with characteristic patience. Though no longer disguised as Hollister's tracker, he maintained careful neutrality in his interactions with white authorities, serving as crucial liaison between federal officials and Sioux leaders throughout the investigation. The judge had questions about my future plans, Charlotte explained as she joined him, the document secured inside her reticule. It seems my return to Boston is not the only option available. Swifthawk nodded, unsurprised. The White Fathers in Washington sometimes recognize value where their local representatives see only obstacles. Your actions have drawn attention from those with authority to implement change. They've offered me a position investigating corruption across territorial jurisdictions. She still struggled to believe the proposition herself. A woman serving in an official capacity with authority similar to a federal marshal. A subtle smile touched Swifthawk's typically stoic expression. The mask you wore revealed capabilities that existed beneath it all along. Perhaps now others begin to see what was always present. Charlotte appreciated his perspective. The disguise had been a practical necessity, but the courage, determination, and intelligence she had demonstrated were inherently her own, not products of her male persona. "What of your future?" she asked, realizing they had spoken little of what would follow once the judicial proceedings concluded. "Will you return to your people now that the immediate threat has been addressed?" Swifthawk gazed toward the distant mountains that marked the boundary of reservation lands. "My journey continues in different form. Chief Standing Bear has asked me to serve as official representative to territorial authorities to ensure agreements made are agreements kept." "A diplomat," Charlotte observed with approval, "using your understanding of both worlds to protect your people's interests, as you might use your unique perspective to protect the vulnerable regardless of their origin," he countered. "We have both lived between worlds. Such experiences provide vision others lack." They walked together toward the fort's western gate, their paths aligned for the moment, though their futures remained uncertain. The conspiracy they had exposed had created an unusual alliance between federal authorities and Sioux leaders, between military officers and civilian witnesses, between a schoolteacher from Boston and a Harvard-educated indigenous man who had each adopted disguises to navigate a complex and often hostile landscape. "I received a letter from Mrs. Whitehorse this morning," Charlotte mentioned, as they passed the fort's perimeter. "Clearwater Junction has appointed a new sheriff, a former Army lieutenant with reputation for fairness. Apparently, he's actively recruiting deputies from both settler and indigenous communities." "Small changes," Swifthawk acknowledged. "The beginning of new possibilities, perhaps, or simply practical necessity in territories where different peoples must coexist." Charlotte had grown more pragmatic during her journey, recognizing that justice rarely emerged from idealism alone, but rather through persistent effort against entrenched power. They paused at the crossroads where the military road from Fort Richardson split, one path leading toward Clearwater Junction and settled territories, the other toward the Sioux Reservation, where Swifthawk would report to Chief Standing Bear before assuming his new diplomatic responsibilities. "I never expected to find an ally in my quest for justice," Charlotte admitted, the pending separation prompting unusual directness. "Certainly not one who first discovered me through my disguise." Swifthawk studied her with the perceptive gaze that had initially penetrated her careful deception at the Silver Dollar Ranch. "When paths align toward justice, differences in origin matter less than shared destination. Poetic, Charlotte smiled. The Harvard education reveals itself occasionally. As does the Boston school teacher, he returned with rare humor, despite the pistol hidden in your skirts. Charlotte's hand moved instinctively toward the small pocket sewn into her new dress, a modification she had specifically requested from the fort's seamstress. Some adaptations from her time as Charlie Hawkins remained practical regardless of her outward appearance. The territorial governor has requested my presence at the reservation negotiations next month, she said, changing subjects. If I accept this investigative position, our paths will likely cross again. I anticipate such meetings, Swifthawk replied with formal dignity that nevertheless conveyed genuine sentiment. The territory benefits when those who seek truth can recognize it in unexpected forms. Their farewell was brief, neither being inclined toward effusive displays, yet carried the weight of shared experiences that few others could comprehend. As Swifthawk mounted his paint stallion and headed westward, Charlotte watched his departing figure with complex emotions. Their alliance had formed through necessity, evolved through mutual respect, and concluded with recognition that each had permanent claims on the other's regard, transcending conventional relationships. 2 weeks later, Charlotte stood on the boardwalk outside Blackwater's modest courthouse, watching as workmen installed a freshly painted sign, Territorial Investigative Office, Federal Court Division. Inside, a small desk awaited its occupant, the first woman appointed to an official law enforcement position in the territory's history. The appointment had generated considerable controversy, objections from traditional quarters, skepticism from some law enforcement officials, and cautious support from those who recognized the need for new approaches to persistent problems. Judge Whitman had overridden objections with uncharacteristic fervor, citing Charlotte's extraordinary service to territorial security and unique investigative capabilities demonstrated during the Hollister conspiracy. Miss Hawkins, Charlotte turned to find a young deputy standing respectfully behind her, hat in hand. Sheriff Pearson asked if you might join him this afternoon. There's been reports of land fraud near Cooper's Creek, similar patterns to what you uncovered with Hollister, though smaller scale. Tell Sheriff Pearson I'll review any documentation he has available, she replied, the formality of her new position still unfamiliar. And Deputy Torres, when addressing me in my official capacity, the appropriate title is Investigator Hawkins. The young man nodded, replacing his hat. Yes, ma'am. I mean, investigator. Sheriff thought you might want this too. He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper, said it belonged to your brother. Alone on the boardwalk, Charlotte carefully unwrapped the package to find Thomas's sheriff's badge, polished to a high shine and mounted on a leather credential folder bearing the federal court's seal. Beneath it lay a brief note in Sheriff Pearson's handwriting. He would be proud of what you've become. Charlotte traced the star's outline with her fingertip, remembering the identical badge she had found among Thomas's possessions after his funeral. The one she had carried throughout her journey as Charlie Hawkins, a talisman connecting her to the brother whose killers she had pursued across half a continent. That badge now rested in a small memorial she had established in Thomas's former office, a reminder of the man whose commitment to justice had ultimately cost his life, but inspired her transformation from grieving sister to agent of that same justice. The new badge represented something different, not borrowed authority or vicarious purpose, but recognition of her own capabilities, officially acknowledged, despite the limitations society typically imposed on women. The journey that had begun with disguise and deception had concluded with an identity more authentic than any she had previously claimed. From the sheriff's office across the street, Charlotte caught sight of a wanted poster on the bulletin board, the distinctive silhouette of a woman wearing a hat labeled the Lady Bandit of Copper Canyon. Beneath it, smaller text described a series of stagecoach robberies targeting mining payrolls, perpetrated by a woman using skills typically associated with male outlaws. Charlotte studied the illustration with professional interest, mentally, cataloging details that might prove relevant if the case crossed jurisdictional boundaries. Another woman defying conventional limitations, though toward criminal rather than just ends. The frontier continued creating opportunities for those willing to step beyond traditional roles, for better or worse. Inside her new office, Charlotte arranged the sparse furnishings with practical efficiency. Filing cabinet for case documentation, map of territorial jurisdictions on the wall, her brother's legal reference books on a small shelf. From her valise, she extracted one final item, the small derringer she had carried throughout her journey west, now cleaned and loaded. As she placed it in the desk drawer, Charlotte reflected on the extraordinary path that had brought her to this moment. She had left Boston seeking vengeance for Thomas's murder, discarding her identity as a respectable schoolteacher to adopt a disguise that granted her freedom to pursue justice. That pursuit had led to unexpected alliances, dangerous confrontations, and ultimately to a conspiracy whose exposure had altered the territory's future. Now Charlotte Hawkins occupied an unprecedented position, a woman with official authority, to investigate corruption across county lines, her gender simultaneously a limitation to be navigated and an asset that allowed her to access information closed to male investigators. The skills she had developed as Charlie Hawkins remained valuable, though now deployed in service of the law rather than outside it. A knock at the door interrupted her arrangements. Sheriff Pearson entered, case files tucked under his arm and respect evident in his manner, despite the novelty of reporting to a female investigator. "Got those land records you requested, Investigator Hawkins?" he announced, placing the documents on her desk. "And a witness just rode in from Cooper's Creek. Says he has information about officials accepting bribes to misrecord property boundaries." Charlotte nodded, opening the first file with focused attention. "Let's see where the evidence leads us, Sheriff." The familiar phrase, one Thomas had often used in his letters describing particularly challenging cases, felt right as it crossed her lips. Charlotte Hawkins, once disguised as a cowboy seeking justice for her murdered brother, had found her true identity not by returning to her former life, but by embracing the strengths her journey had revealed. As she began reviewing the evidence, Charlotte's thoughts briefly turned to Swift Hawk, now representing his people's interests in territorial negotiations. Their paths had diverged, but moved in parallel directions, each working within systems that had once excluded them, using their unique perspectives to protect vulnerable communities from powerful interests that viewed justice as negotiable. Seasonal winds swept down from distant mountains, carrying change across a territory still defining itself. In Blackwater's newly established federal investigative office, Charlotte Hawkins opened her first official case, her disguise discarded, but her determination undimmed. A woman reclaiming her true identity while forging a path no others had traveled before. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.